Welcome to No Sleep Historian, where the past never rests easy, and the truth was buried for a reason. They weren't the ones you read about in textbooks, not Salem, not the ones with movies made about them. These witch trials happened in silence, in the cold corners of Europe, beneath the shadow of forgotten churches, in isolated forests, ancient villages, and snow-covered fields. Some ended in fire, others in water, and many in mass graves with no names left to remember. The accusers were often children, the judges, priests, the condemned, usually women. But behind every accusation, there was something more: power, fear, faith, lies. This is not a story about witches. It's a story about what people will do when they believe evil is real, and they think they're the ones sent to stop it. This is the witch trials no one talks about. Part 1. The Torsker Massacre, Sweden's forgotten bloodbath. The morning mist clung to the hills of Torsker Parish like a shroud on May 25, 1675. By sunset, 71 people would be dead, their heads severed from their bodies in what remains one of history's most concentrated acts of judicial murder. This was not a mob lynching or a moment of collective madness. This was systematic, methodical, and sanctioned by the Swedish crown. The man responsible, a priest named Laurentius Christofori Hornius, whose obsession with purging evil from his parish would transform a quiet corner of Dalarna into a killing field. The seeds of the Torsker massacre were planted years earlier, during Sweden's witch panic of the 1660s and 1670s. The Great Delusion, as historians would later call it, swept through the kingdom like a plague. But nowhere did it take root more deeply than in the remote parishes of central Sweden, where ancient pagan traditions still whispered beneath the surface of Christian faith. These were communities where the old ways died hard, where wise women still knew the healing properties of forest herbs, and where the boundary between the natural and supernatural remained thin. Laurentius Hornius arrived in Torsker in 1664, a man burning with righteous fury and armed with the theological certainty that Satan had established strongholds in the Swedish countryside. Unlike many of his contemporaries who viewed witchcraft accusations with skepticism, Hornius embraced them with the fervor of a crusader. He had studied the writings of Heinrich Kramer and Jakob Sprenger, authors of the infamous Malleus Maleficarum, and he believed every word. To him, the women of his parish who practiced folk medicine, midwifery, and healing were not benign practitioners of ancient knowledge, but servants of the devil himself. The trigger for the massacre came in the form of a child's testimony. A young girl named Gertrude Svensdotter claimed she had been taken by witches to Blekula, the mythical meadow where Swedish folklore claimed witches gathered to dance with the devil. Her story, filled with vivid details of flying through the air and participating in dark rituals, captivated Hornius. But Gertrude's testimony was just the beginning. Soon, more children came forward with similar tales, each more elaborate than the last. What made the Torsker case unique was not just the scale of the accusations, but the systematic way in which Hornius pursued them. He established a network of informants throughout the parish, encouraging children to spy on their own families and neighbors. He preached sermons that painted witchcraft as a contagious evil that threatened the very soul of the community. He created an atmosphere of paranoia and fear, where the slightest deviation from strict Christian behavior could be interpreted as evidence of diabolical pact. The accused were predominantly women, ranging in age from their teens to their 80s. Many were widows, living alone and vulnerable to suspicion. Others were healers and midwives whose knowledge of herbs and traditional medicine made them natural targets. Some were simply women who had fallen afoul of their neighbors in disputes over land, money, or personal grudges. The youngest victim was just 15 years old. The trials themselves were a mockery of justice. Hornius served as both prosecutor and judge, accepting the testimony of children as irrefutable evidence while dismissing the desperate pleas of the accused. Torture was employed liberally to extract confessions, with the priest justifying such methods as necessary to save souls from eternal damnation. Those who confessed were promised mercy, but mercy in Hornius's court meant a swift death rather than prolonged suffering. The Swedish legal system of the time required that death sentences be confirmed by higher courts, but Hornius manipulated this process with disturbing efficiency. He compiled detailed reports of the confessions, complete with lurid descriptions of diabolic rituals and sabbats. He emphasized the threat that these witches posed to the entire kingdom, arguing that swift action was necessary to prevent the spread of their evil influence. The appeals court, overwhelmed by the volume of cases and convinced by Hornius's passionate advocacy, rubber-stamped the death sentences. On that terrible day in May, the executions began at dawn. Unlike the burnings that characterized witch trials elsewhere in Europe, Swedish law mandated beheading for those convicted of witchcraft. The executioner, a man named Hans Schwan, worked methodically through the list of condemned contemporary accounts, describe how the women faced their deaths with varying degrees of resignation, terror, and defiance. Some maintained their innocence to the end, while others, broken by torture and imprisonment, confessed to crimes they had never committed. The aftermath of the Torsker massacre was immediate and devastating. Entire families were wiped out, leaving orphaned children and empty homes scattered throughout the parish. The social fabric of the community was torn apart, with neighbors who had once lived in harmony now viewing each other with suspicion and fear. The economic impact was severe, as the loss of so many women meant the loss of their labor in fields, homes, and workshops. But perhaps more disturbing than the immediate consequences was the silence that followed. Within decades, the Torsker massacre had largely disappeared from Swedish historical consciousness. Official records were buried in archives, and the story was relegated to whispered tales passed down through generations. This was not accidental. The Swedish crown, embarrassed by the excesses of its witch trials, actively suppressed discussion of events like Torsker. The massacre became an inconvenient truth that challenged the narrative of Sweden as an enlightened Protestant nation. Modern historians have only recently begun to uncover the full extent of what happened at Torsker. Archaeological excavations have revealed mass graves containing the remains of the executed women, their bones bearing the marks of decapitation. Church records, once thought lost, have been discovered in dusty archives, providing detailed accounts of the trials and executions. These documents paint a picture of systematic judicial murder carried out under the guise of religious purification. The Torsker massacre stands as a stark reminder of the dangers of religious extremism and the vulnerability of marginalized communities in times of social upheaval. It challenges our assumptions about the witch trials as primarily a medieval phenomenon, showing how similar dynamics could emerge in supposedly more enlightened periods. The 71 women who died that day were not witches. They were healers, mothers, daughters, and neighbors whose only crime was being different in a world that demanded conformity. Part 2. the Vardø witches, Norway's trials under the northern lights. At the edge of the world, where the Arctic Ocean meets the Barents Sea, lies the island of Vardø. Here, beyond the reach of most European influence, ancient Norse traditions mingled with Sami shamanism under the dancing lights of the Aurora Borealis. It was a place where the boundary between the natural and supernatural seemed particularly thin, where the howling winds and crushing ice made survival itself feel like a battle against otherworldly forces. In this harsh landscape, Norway's most brutal witch trials would unfold, claiming the lives of dozens of women who were accused of commanding storms, sinking ships, and flying through the polar night. The Vardø witch trials began in 1621, during a period of intense religious and political upheaval in Norway. The country was under Danish rule, and the Lutheran Church was working aggressively to stamp out what it saw as pagan survivals among the population. Nowhere was this effort more challenging than in Finnmark, Norway's northernmost province, where the indigenous Sami people maintained their traditional spiritual practices alongside newer Christian converts who still honored the old Norse gods. Vardø itself was a strategic outpost, serving as the northernmost fortress in the Danish-Norwegian kingdom. The island's residents were a mix of Norwegian settlers, Sami herders, and international traders who came to fish the rich Arctic waters. This cultural diversity, combined with the extreme isolation and harsh living conditions, created a perfect breeding ground for suspicion and fear. When ships were lost in sudden storms or fishing expeditions ended in tragedy, the community needed someone to blame. The first accusations came from a most unlikely source, a Scottish merchant named John Cunningham, who had arrived in Vardø to trade in fish and fur. Cunningham claimed that during a violent storm, he had witnessed several local women flying through the air, commanding the winds and waves. His testimony, given before the local magistrate, described seeing these women in their supernatural forms, their hair streaming in the wind as they danced above the churning sea. What made Cunningham's accusations particularly dangerous was his status as an outsider with no obvious motive for making false claims. Unlike accusations that arose from local disputes or personal grudges, his testimony appeared to be that of a neutral observer. The local authorities, already predisposed to view the mixing of cultures and traditions as spiritually dangerous, took his claims seriously. The first woman to be arrested was Margrethe Jonsteder, a respected midwife and healer who had lived on Vardø for over 30 years. Margrethe possessed extensive knowledge of traditional medicine, using herbs and rituals that combined Christian prayers with much older healing practices. Her arrest sent shockwaves through the community, as she was known for her kindness and skill in helping women through difficult childbirths. Under interrogation, Margrethe initially denied all accusations, but as the questioning continued and torture was applied, her story began to change. She confessed to meeting with other women on a remote part of the island where they would practice what she called the old ways. These gatherings, she claimed, involved rituals to ensure good weather for fishing and protection for their families during the long Arctic winter. The authorities interpreted these confessions as evidence of witchcraft, but a closer examination reveals something more complex. What Margrethe described were likely traditional women's rituals that had been practiced in the Arctic for generations. These ceremonies involved appeals to various spirits and forces of nature, blending Christian symbolism with pre-Christian beliefs. In the context of 17th century theology, however, any spiritual practice outside the official church was suspect. As the investigations continued, more women were arrested. The pattern was always the same: initial denials, followed by confessions extracted through torture and psychological pressure. The confessions themselves reveal the cultural complexity of the region. Many of the accused women described rituals that incorporated elements of Sami shamanism, Norse paganism, and folk Christianity. They spoke of spirit journeys, weather magic, and communication with the dead, practices that would have been familiar to indigenous peoples throughout the Arctic. The trials took on a particularly brutal character due to the involvement of a local priest named Petter Klingenberg. Klingenberg had been appointed to Vardø specifically to combat what church authorities saw as the persistence of pagan practices in the region. He viewed the witch trials as an opportunity to demonstrate his zeal and advance his career within the church hierarchy. Under his influence, the trials became increasingly theological in nature, with elaborate interrogations designed to uncover evidence of diabolic pacts and sabbats. The geographic isolation of Vardø worked against the accused women in multiple ways. First, it meant that they had little access to legal representation or support from higher authorities. Second, the small size of the community meant that rumors and accusations spread quickly, creating an atmosphere of panic. Third, the extreme weather conditions made it difficult for accused women to flee, trapping them on the island with their accusers. The executions began in 1623 and continued sporadically for over a decade. Unlike the mass execution at Torsker, the Vardø trials unfolded over a longer period, with individual women being condemned and killed as new accusations emerged. The method of execution varied, with some women being burned alive while others were drowned in the icy waters surrounding the island. The choice of method often reflected the specific crimes of which they were accused. Those guilty of weather magic might be drowned, while those accused of diabolic worship were burned. One of the most disturbing aspects of the Vardø trials was the way they targeted the cultural knowledge and practices of women. Many of the accused were repositories of traditional knowledge about healing, midwifery, and spiritual practices. Their deaths represented not just individual tragedies, but the systematic destruction of indigenous cultural heritage. The trials effectively eliminated a generation of traditional healers and spiritual guides, leaving the community dependent on male church officials for guidance. The international character of the accusations at Vardø also reflected broader patterns of cultural conflict in the region. The Arctic was a frontier zone where different peoples and traditions intersected, often uneasily. The witch trials can be understood as part of a broader process of cultural colonization, in which dominant religious and political authorities sought to impose uniformity on diverse populations. The trials finally ended in the 1630s, not because of any change in attitude toward witchcraft, but because the community had been so devastated that there were few women left to accuse. The population of Vardø had been decimated, and the cultural traditions that had sustained the community for generations had been largely destroyed. The island's economy, dependent on the knowledge and labor of women who had been executed, collapsed. Today, Vardø is home to the Stilneset Memorial, a striking modern monument designed by architect Peter Zumthor and artist Louise Bourgeois to commemorate the victims of the witch trials. The memorial consists of a long corridor with 91 small windows, each representing one of the women who died. At the end of the corridor sits a separate structure housing Bourgeois' steel and glass sculpture, the damned, the possessed, and the beloved, which burns with an eternal flame. The Vardu witch trials represent one of the most extreme examples of cultural conflict played out through accusations of witchcraft. They demonstrate how religious authorities could use witch panic to eliminate practices and people they saw as threatening to their authority. The trials also show how geographic isolation and harsh living conditions could intensify suspicion and fear, creating conditions where the most vulnerable members of society became scapegoats for natural disasters and social tensions. Part 3. The Mora Witch Panic, Sweden's Child Witnesses of Darkness. In the summer of 1669, the Swedish village of Mora was gripped by a panic unlike anything in recorded history. Children, some as young as 7 years old, began telling elaborate stories of being kidnapped by witches and taken to a place called Blakula, where they witnessed diabolic rituals and supernatural horrors. What made this case unique was not just the scale of the accusations, but the fact that the primary witnesses were children whose testimony was accepted without question by adult authorities. The resulting trials would claim the lives of dozens of people and reveal the terrifying power of mass hysteria when combined with religious extremism. The Mora witch panic began with a single child named Gertrud Svensdotter, an 11-year-old girl who claimed she had been taken by witches to Blakula during the night. Her story was remarkably detailed and consistent. She described being carried through the air by women from her village, landing in a beautiful meadow where hundreds of people gathered to worship the devil. She spoke of elaborate feasts, dancing, and rituals that involved the desecration of Christian symbols. Most disturbing of all, she named specific women from Mora as her abductors. What set Gertrud's testimony apart from typical witch accusations was the sheer specificity of her claims. She could describe the layout of Blakula in minute detail, including the location of buildings, the appearance of the devil himself, and the specific roles played by different members of the community. She claimed that children were brought to this place not as victims, but as participants in the diabolic rituals. According to her testimony, the adult witches were training the children to become servants of Satan. The authorities in Mora were initially skeptical of Gertrud's claims. The local pastor, Elias Eriksson, had received education in theology and was aware of the debates raging among European intellectuals about the reality of witchcraft. He questioned Gertrude extensively, looking for inconsistencies in her story or evidence that she might be fabricating her claims. But Gertrude's testimony remained consistent, and more troubling still, other children began to come forward with similar stories. Within weeks, dozens of children were reporting identical experiences. They described being taken to Blakula, participating in the same rituals, and witnessing the same supernatural events. The consistency of their testimonies was remarkable, with children providing corroborating details about events they claimed to have witnessed together. They could describe the appearance and behavior of specific adults, the layout of the diabolic gathering place, and the nature of the rituals they had supposedly witnessed. The children's testimonies revealed a complex mythology that blended Christian theological concepts with Swedish folklore. Blakula was described as a real place, accessible through supernatural means, where the normal rules of reality did not apply. The children spoke of being transported there by flying through the air, often riding on the backs of animals or supernatural beings. Once there, they participated in elaborate ceremonies that inverted Christian rituals, including the desecration of communion elements and the worship of Satan in the form of a great black beast. What made the children's testimonies particularly compelling to adult authorities was their apparent knowledge of theological concepts and ritualistic details that seemed beyond their years. They spoke knowledgeably about diabolic pacts, the hierarchy of demons, and the specific methods by which Satan corrupted human souls. This knowledge, the authorities reasoned, could only have been acquired through direct experience of the supernatural events they described. The investigation took a dramatic turn when the children began to demonstrate what they claimed were supernatural abilities learned at Belkula. Several children reported that they could now see through the deceptions of the adult witches and identify others who had been present at the diabolic gatherings. They would point to specific women in the community and describe their roles in the supernatural rituals. Some children claimed they could predict when the next gathering would occur or identify objects that had been used in the diabolic ceremonies. The adult authorities faced an unprecedented situation. The consistency and detail of the children's testimonies seemed to provide overwhelming evidence of a vast conspiracy of witchcraft within their community. The alternative explanation, that dozens of children were either lying or suffering from some form of mass delusion, seemed equally implausible. The religious worldview of the time provided a framework for understanding the children's claims as genuine supernatural experiences. The first arrests were made in August 1669, targeting the women most frequently named by the children. These were primarily older women, many of whom served as healers, midwives, or practitioners of traditional folk medicine. The pattern was familiar from other witch trials, but the scale was unprecedented. Within months, over 70 people had been arrested, the vast majority of them women. The trials themselves were shaped by the unique nature of the evidence. The children were called as witnesses, and their testimony was given extraordinary weight. Unlike adult witnesses, who might be suspected of having ulterior motives or personal grudges, the children were seen as innocent vessels through which divine truth was being revealed. Their accounts were accepted as factual descriptions of supernatural events rather than as potentially unreliable testimony requiring corroboration. The accused women found themselves in an impossible position. They were being asked to defend themselves against charges based on events that allegedly occurred in a supernatural realm, witnessed primarily by children who claimed to have been present through magical transportation. Traditional forms of evidence and alibi were rendered meaningless when the crimes were said to have been committed in a place accessible only through supernatural means. Some of the accused women initially maintained their innocence, but as the pressure mounted and torture was applied, many began to confess. These confessions often closely matched the children's testimonies, describing the same rituals, the same supernatural transportation, and the same diabolic gatherings. The consistency between the children's accounts and the adult confessions seemed to provide additional confirmation of the reality of the events. The psychological dynamics of the Mora, which panic revealed the complex interplay between individual psychology and social pressure. The children who initiated the accusations may have been responding to various factors: the stress of living in a religious community with high expectations for moral behavior, the attention and importance they received when telling their stories, or genuine psychological disturbances that manifested in the form of supernatural claims. Once the initial accusations were made and taken seriously by adults, a feedback loop was created. Children who had not previously reported supernatural experiences began to remember similar events. The detailed testimonies of the first accusers provided a template that other children could follow, ensuring consistency in their accounts. The social pressure to conform, combined with the excitement and attention that came with being a witness to supernatural events, created powerful incentives for children to participate in the growing narrative. The trials reached their climax in the summer of 1670, when a special commission was appointed by the Swedish crown to investigate the situation in Mora. The commission, headed by prominent judges and theologians, arrived expecting to find evidence of a vast diabolic conspiracy. Instead, they found a community in the grip of mass hysteria, with children and adults alike caught up in a shared delusion that had taken on a life of its own. The Commission's investigation revealed troubling inconsistencies in the children's testimonies. When questioned separately and in detail, the children's stories began to diverge. Some admitted that they had never actually been to Belkula, but had heard descriptions from other children and incorporated these details into their own accounts. Others revealed that they had been coached by adults who were eager to uncover evidence of witchcraft in their community. The revelation that the children's testimonies were unreliable came too late for many of the accused. By the time the commission completed its investigation, 15 adults had been executed, and dozens of others had died in prison while awaiting trial. The social fabric of the community had been torn apart, with families destroyed and neighbors turned against each other based on the word of children who had been caught up in a collective fantasy. The Mora witch panic stands as one of the most disturbing examples of how the testimony of children can be manipulated and distorted in the context of moral panic. It demonstrates the dangers of accepting uncorroborated testimony, particularly when that testimony confirms existing fears and prejudices. The case also reveals how religious authority and social pressure can combine to create conditions where even the most fantastic claims are accepted as truth. Part 4. The Finnmark Trials. When fire reached the Arctic, in the vast expanse of northern Norway, where the sun disappears for months at a time and the aurora borealis paints the sky in ethereal colors, the Finnmark witch trials unfolded as one of Europe's most devastating campaigns of persecution. Between 1593 and 1692, this remote Arctic region witnessed the systematic destruction of its female population through accusations of witchcraft. What made these trials particularly brutal was not just their scale, but their deliberate targeting of indigenous Sami women and the traditional knowledge they carried. By the time the fires were extinguished, entire communities had lost nearly all their women, leaving behind a traumatized population and a cultural heritage that would take centuries to recover. Finnmark, Norway's northernmost county, was a frontier region where multiple cultures intersected uneasily. The indigenous Sami people had inhabited these lands for thousands of years, developing sophisticated spiritual practices and survival techniques adapted to the harsh Arctic environment. During the medieval period, Norwegian settlers began moving into the region, bringing with them Christianity and European legal systems. The result was a complex cultural landscape where traditional Sami shamanism coexisted with Norse paganism and emerging Christian beliefs. The Lutheran Reformation of the 16th century dramatically altered this delicate balance. The new Protestant church, backed by the Danish-Norwegian crown, launched an aggressive campaign to eliminate what it saw as pagan survivals throughout the kingdom. Nowhere was this campaign more intensive than in Finnmark, where traditional spiritual practices remained strong and visible. The church identified Sami shamans, known as Noadi, as particular threats to Christian authority, but it soon became clear that the persecution would extend far beyond traditional spiritual leaders. The first major witch trial in Finnmark took place in 1593 in the village of Vadsøy, where a Sami woman named Else Knutsdatter was accused of using magic to cause storms and shipwrecks. The charges against her reflected the complex cultural dynamics of the region. Else was accused of practicing both traditional Sami magic and European-style witchcraft, suggesting that the authorities were conflating different spiritual traditions in their efforts to identify and eliminate supernatural threats. The case against Else Knutsdatter established patterns that would characterize Finnmark witch trials for the next century. The accused were typically women who possessed traditional knowledge about healing, whether prediction or spiritual practices. They were charged with crimes that reflected specifically Arctic concerns, causing storms that threatened fishing vessels, using magic to control reindeer herds, or communicating with spirits that lived in the harsh northern landscape. The trials gained momentum under the influence of a series of zealous officials who saw the persecution of alleged witches as a way to advance their careers and demonstrate their religious devotion. One of the most notorious was Peter Klingenberg, who served as pastor in several Finnmark communities during the early 17th century. Klingenberg viewed the witch trials as a holy crusade against Satan's influence in the Arctic, and he worked tirelessly to identify and prosecute women he suspected of practicing witchcraft. Under Klingenberg's influence, the trials took on an increasingly systematic character. He developed networks of informants throughout the region, encouraging people to report suspicious behavior or unusual occurrences. He preached sermons that portrayed witchcraft as a contagious evil that threatened the entire community, creating an atmosphere of fear and suspicion that made accusations more likely. Most importantly, he lobbied higher authorities to take the witch threat seriously, arguing that the remote location of Finnmark made it a perfect refuge for Satan's servants. The geographic isolation of Finnmark worked to intensify the witch panic in several ways. First, the extreme distances and harsh travel conditions meant that accused women had little chance of fleeing to safety. Second, the small size of most communities meant that accusations spread quickly and had devastating effects on social cohesion. Third, the harsh environmental conditions made survival dependent on community cooperation. So the disruption caused by witch accusations often had life or death consequences. The trials also reflected the complex ethnic and cultural dynamics of the region. While both Sami and Norwegian women were accused of witchcraft, the charges often reflected different cultural assumptions about supernatural power. Sami women were typically accused of practicing traditional shamanic arts, while Norwegian women were more likely to be charged with European-style witchcraft involving diabolic pacts and sabbats. These differences reflected the authorities' attempts to understand and categorize unfamiliar spiritual practices within familiar theological frameworks. One of the most disturbing aspects of the Finnmark trials was their targeting of traditional ecological knowledge. Many of the accused women were healers and midwives who possessed extensive knowledge of Arctic plants, animal behavior, and weather patterns. Their ability to predict storms, locate game animals, or treat illnesses with local herbs was reinterpreted as evidence of supernatural power obtained through diabolic means. The trials thus represented not just religious persecution, but a systematic attack on indigenous knowledge systems. The scale of the Finnmark trials was unprecedented in Scandinavian history. Court records, many of which survive in Danish archives, document the execution of at least 135 people between 1593 and 1692, with the vast majority being women. However, historians believe the actual number was likely much higher, as many trials were conducted locally without generating surviving documentation. Some communities lost 80 to 90% of their female population, creating demographic catastrophes that took generations to recover from. The methods of execution varied depending on the specific charges and local customs. Some women were burned alive, while others were drowned in the icy waters of the Arctic Ocean. The choice of method, the social and economic consequences of the trials were devastating. The loss of so many women disrupted family structures, eliminated traditional knowledge, and created communities where normal social reproduction became impossible. Many children were orphaned, and many men were left without wives or mothers. The traditional economy, which depended heavily on women's knowledge of food preservation, textile production, and other essential skills, collapsed in many areas. The trials also had profound cultural consequences for the Sami people. Many traditional spiritual practices were driven underground or lost entirely, as practitioners were executed or intimidated into silence. The systematic persecution of Noadi and other spiritual leaders disrupted the transmission of traditional knowledge from one generation to the next. The psychological trauma of the trials created a climate of fear that discouraged the open practice of traditional culture for centuries. The Finnmark trials finally began to decline in the late 17th century, not because of any change in attitudes toward witchcraft, but because the communities had been so devastated that there were few women left to accuse. The demographic collapse forced authorities to recognize that the trials were destroying the very communities they were supposed to protect. New officials arriving in the region were horrified by the desolation they found and began to question the wisdom of continued persecution. The last major witch trial in Finnmark took place in 1692. Her trial marked the end of an era, as changing intellectual currents in Europe had begun to cast doubt on the reality of witchcraft. The new generation of officials was less likely to accept supernatural explanations for natural phenomena, and more skeptical of testimony obtained through torture and intimidation. The legacy of the Finnmark trials extends far beyond their immediate historical impact. They represent one of the most extreme examples of cultural genocide in European history, demonstrating how accusations of witchcraft could be used to systematically eliminate indigenous knowledge and practices. The trials also reveal the devastating consequences of religious extremism when combined with ethnic prejudice and administrative power. Today, the Finnmark trials are remembered as a dark chapter in Norwegian history, but their full impact is still being uncovered by historians and anthropologists. Archaeological investigations have revealed mass graves and execution sites throughout the region, providing physical evidence of the scale of the persecution. Efforts to document and preserve traditional Sami knowledge have taken on new urgency as scholars recognize how much was lost during the witch trials. They demonstrate how accusations of witchcraft could be weaponized to eliminate people and practices that dominant authorities found threatening or incomprehensible. The fires that burned in the Arctic darkness consumed not just individual lives, but entire ways of life, leaving scars that are still visible in the cultural landscape of northern Norway. Part 5. The Zugarrammer D. Witches, Spain's Forgotten Inquisition. in the mist-shrouded mountains of the Basque Country, where ancient traditions ran as deep as the valleys carved by glacial waters, the Spanish Inquisition turned its fearsome attention to a threat it had long ignored: witchcraft. The year was 1610, and in the small village of Zugarramurdi, nestled in the foothills of the Pyrenees, a series of accusations would trigger one of the most extensive witch investigations in European history. Over 7,000 people would be investigated, entire communities would be torn apart, and the very nature of the Spanish Inquisition would be transformed by an encounter with beliefs and practices that challenged its fundamental assumptions about heresy, faith, and the supernatural. The Basque region straddled the border between France and Spain, a mountainous territory where ancient pre-Christian traditions had survived longer than in most of Europe. The Basque people spoke their own language, Euskara, which bore no resemblance to any other European tongue and was believed by many to be a remnant of the original language spoken in Europe before the arrival of Indo-European peoples. They practiced customs that seemed to echo practices from the distant past: communal decision-making, matrilineal inheritance in some areas, and spiritual beliefs that incorporated elements of nature worship alongside Christianity. The Spanish Inquisition, established in 1478, had focused primarily on identifying and eliminating crypto-Jews and crypto-Muslims, people who had converted to Christianity but were suspected of secretly maintaining their original faiths. Witchcraft had been largely ignored as a concern secondary to these more pressing threats to religious orthodoxy. However, by the early 17th century, the major populations of suspected crypto-Jews and crypto-Muslims had been eliminated or driven into exile, and the Inquisition needed new targets to justify its continued existence. The Zugarramurdi witch trials began with the testimony of a French witch named Maria des Amildegui, who had been captured by Spanish authorities while fleeing prosecution in France. Under interrogation, she claimed that she had attended sabbats in the Basque region, gatherings where local witches met to worship the devil and practice malefic magic. She provided detailed descriptions of these gatherings, naming specific locations and individuals who had supposedly participated in the diabolic rituals. Maria's testimony was particularly damaging because she described practices that seemed to blend traditional Basque customs with standard European witchcraft beliefs. She spoke of gatherings in sacred groves where participants honored ancient spirits, but she claimed these spirits were actually demons in disguise. She described healing rituals that incorporated traditional Basque herbs and prayers, but she alleged that these ceremonies were actually diabolic inversions of Christian sacraments. The Inquisition authorities in the Basque region were initially skeptical of Maria's claims. The local inquisitor, Juan del Valle Alvarado, was an experienced investigator who had dealt primarily with cases of heresy and false conversion. He understood that accusations of witchcraft could be motivated by personal grudges, mental illness, or deliberate deception. However, as he began investigating Maria's claims, he found what appeared to be corroborating evidence. Several young women from Zugarramurdi and surrounding villages came forward with their own confessions of witchcraft. They described attending sabbats at a place called Ekler, a meadow sacred to the Basque deity Mari, where they claimed to have worshipped the devil and learned malefic magic. Their testimonies were remarkably consistent, describing similar rituals, the same supernatural experiences, and many of the same participants. What made these confessions particularly compelling to the Inquisition was their apparent corroboration of Catholic theological teachings about witchcraft. The women described making pacts with the devil, renouncing their Christian faith, and participating in rituals that inverted Christian sacraments. They spoke of flying through the air to attend sabbats, transforming into animals, and using magic to harm their neighbors. These elements matched closely with the descriptions of witchcraft found in theological treatises and Inquisition manuals. The investigation quickly expanded beyond Zugarramurdi to encompass the entire Basque region. Teams of inquisitors were dispatched to villages throughout the area, armed with lists of suspected witches and detailed instructions for conducting interrogations. The Inquisition's bureaucratic apparatus, refined through decades of heresy trials, was turned to the task of identifying and prosecuting witches on an unprecedented scale. The methods employed in the Basque witch trials reflected the Inquisition's institutional culture and procedures. Unlike the secular witch trials conducted elsewhere in Europe, the Spanish Inquisition relied heavily on detailed interrogations, extensive documentation, and bureaucratic oversight. Suspected witches were subjected to lengthy questioning sessions, designed to extract detailed confessions about their supernatural activities. The interrogators used standardized lists of questions derived from theological treatises about witchcraft, ensuring consistency across different cases. The Inquisition's approach to torture was also more systematic than in many secular trials. While torture was certainly employed, it was regulated by detailed procedures designed to extract reliable confessions while minimizing the risk of false accusations. The inquisitors understood that torture could produce unreliable testimony, so they developed techniques for verifying confessions through cross-examination and comparison with other evidence. One of the most disturbing aspects of the Basque witch trials was their impact on local communities. The Inquisition's investigations created an atmosphere of suspicion and fear that tore apart the social fabric of Basque society. Neighbors denounced neighbors, family members accused each other, and traditional community bonds were severed by the constant threat of denunciation. The trials revealed the complex relationship between Basque folk culture and Catholic orthodoxy. Many of the practices identified as witchcraft by the Inquisition were actually traditional Basque customs that had been practiced for generations. Healing rituals, seasonal celebrations, and ancestor veneration were reinterpreted through the lens of demonology, transforming benign cultural practices into evidence of diabolic conspiracy. The most prominent figure in the Basque witch trials was Alonso de Salazar, an inquisitor who would ultimately play a crucial role in ending the persecution. Salazar was initially a believer in the reality of the witchcraft threat, but as he investigated the cases more thoroughly, he began to develop serious doubts about the evidence. His careful analysis of the testimonies revealed numerous inconsistencies and contradictions that suggested the confessions might be unreliable. Salazar's investigation was revolutionary in its systematic approach to evaluating supernatural claims. He developed criteria for distinguishing between genuine and false confessions, examined the physical evidence for sabbats and magical practices, and interviewed witnesses who had supposedly attended supernatural gatherings. His findings were devastating to the witch prosecution. He found no reliable evidence that any of the alleged supernatural events had actually occurred. The turning point came when Salazar investigated claims about a massive sabbat that had allegedly been attended by hundreds of witches at Aklar. According to multiple confessions, this gathering had involved elaborate rituals, the physical presence of the devil, and magical activities that should have left physical traces. Salazar's examination of the site revealed no evidence of the alleged activities. The meadow showed no signs of the large gatherings described by the witnesses, and none of the physical evidence that should have resulted from the supernatural activities could be found. More damaging still was Salazar's discovery that many of the supposed witches had been in their homes, under the observation of family members, during the times when they claimed to have been attending Sabbats. The testimonies about flying through the air to attend supernatural gatherings were contradicted by mundane evidence of the accused individuals' physical presence in their beds. This finding suggested that the Sabbat experiences were dreams, fantasies, or deliberate fabrications rather than actual supernatural events. Salazar's investigation also revealed the role of suggestion and coercion in generating confessions. He found that many of the accused had been subjected to intense psychological pressure, leading questions and threats that had shaped their testimonies. The consistency of the confessions, which had initially seemed to prove their accuracy, was revealed to be the result of witnesses learning from each other and from their interrogators what kinds of admissions were expected. The Basque witch trials reached their climax in 1610 with a massive auto de fe in Logroño, where 31 people were condemned for witchcraft. 12 were burned in effigy, having died in prison or fled before trial, while 6 were burned alive. The spectacle was intended to demonstrate the Inquisition's power and the reality of the witchcraft threat. But it would prove to be the beginning of the end for Spanish witch persecution. The aftermath of the Logroño auto de fe was complicated by Salazar's continuing investigation. His reports to the Inquisition's central authorities in Madrid raised serious questions about the reliability of the evidence and the justice of the proceedings. The Supreme Council of the Inquisition, faced with Salazar's detailed analysis, began to reconsider its approach to witchcraft cases. The debate within the Inquisition about the reality of witchcraft reflected broader intellectual currents in early 17th century Europe. Skepticism about supernatural claims was growing among educated elites, and the scientific revolution was beginning to provide alternative explanations for phenomena that had previously been attributed to supernatural causes. The Inquisition, despite its reputation for dogmatic rigidity, was capable of adapting to changing intellectual circumstances. In 1614, the Supreme Council issued new instructions for handling witchcraft cases that reflected Salazar's recommendations. These instructions required much higher standards of evidence for supernatural claims, prohibited the use of leading questions in interrogations, and mandated careful verification of confessions through independent investigation. The effect was to make successful witch prosecutions much more difficult and to reduce the number of cases brought before Inquisition tribunals. The Basque witch trials had profound consequences for the development of the Spanish Inquisition. They marked the beginning of a more skeptical approach to supernatural claims and a greater emphasis on empirical evidence in evaluating accusations. The trials also demonstrated the Inquisition's capacity for self-correction when faced with compelling evidence that its methods were producing unreliable results. The cultural impact of the trials on Basque society was lasting and complex. The persecution forced many traditional practices underground, contributing to the gradual erosion of distinctive Basque cultural elements. However, the trials also created a sense of martyrdom and resistance that strengthened Basque identity in some ways. The memory of the persecution became part of the collective historical consciousness of the Basque people. reinforcing their sense of distinctiveness from Spanish culture. The Zugarramurdi witch trials stand out in the history of European witch persecution for several reasons. They represented one of the largest witch investigations in European history, involving thousands of suspects across a wide geographic area. They demonstrated the capacity of institutional structures to both perpetuate and eventually correct systematic injustices. Most importantly, they showed how cultural conflicts could be played out through accusations of witchcraft, with indigenous traditions being reinterpreted as diabolic threats. The trials also highlighted the role of individual agency in shaping historical outcomes. Salazar's courage in challenging the assumptions of his institution and his meticulous approach to evaluating evidence played a crucial role in ending the persecution. His work demonstrated that even in highly authoritarian institutions, individuals could make a difference by insisting on rigorous standards of evidence and logical analysis. The legacy of the Zugarramurdi witch trials extends beyond their immediate historical impact. They provide insight into the complex relationship between religious authority, cultural diversity, and social control in early modern Europe. They demonstrate how accusations of witchcraft could be used to attack cultural practices that dominant authorities found threatening or incomprehensible. At the same time, they show how institutional mechanisms for review and correction could eventually triumph over prejudice and superstition. Today, Zugarramurdi is a small tourist destination where visitors can explore the caves where sabbats allegedly took place and learn about the history of the witch trials. The village has embraced its connection to the witch trials, but in a way that emphasizes the injustice of the persecution rather than the reality of the supernatural claims. The transformation of Zugarramurdi from a site of persecution to a place of historical memory reflects broader changes in how European societies remember and interpret their history of witch trials. The Basque witch trials remind us that the persecution of supposed witches was not just a medieval phenomenon, but continued well into the early modern period. They show how sophisticated institutional structures could be turned to the task of systematic persecution, but also how those same structures could be reformed when confronted with compelling evidence of their failures. The trials stand as a testament to both the capacity for human societies to commit terrible injustices and their ability to recognize and correct those injustices when presented with sufficient evidence and moral courage. Part 6. The Wurzburg and Bamberg Trials, Germany's Witch Empire. In the heart of the Holy Roman Empire, two neighboring prince-bishoprics became the epicenter of what historians now call the most systematic and brutal witch-hunting campaign in European history. Between 1626 and 1631, the ecclesiastical territories of Wurzburg and Bamberg transformed into killing fields, where over 1,500 souls met their end at the stake. This was not the work of superstitious peasants or mob hysteria. This was bureaucratic murder, conducted with the precision of a modern corporation and the blessing of the highest religious authorities. The architect of this horror was Prince Bishop Julius Ector von Mespelbrunn in Wurzburg, whose successor, Gottfried Johann Georg Fuchs Dornheim, would carry the torch of persecution to even greater heights. In neighboring Bamberg, Prince Bishop Gottfried Fuchs von Dornheim orchestrated a parallel campaign of such ferocity that it earned him the nickname the Witch Bishop. These men were not wild-eyed fanatics. They were educated, powerful prelates who wielded both spiritual and temporal authority over their domains. What made these trials uniquely terrifying was their methodical nature. The prince-bishops established what amounted to witch-hunting factories, complete with specialized courts, professional interrogators, and standardized procedures for extracting confessions. They constructed purpose-built prisons with sophisticated torture chambers, designed not just to break bodies, but to systematically destroy the human spirit. The infamous witch prison in Bamberg still stands today, its cells bearing witness to unspeakable suffering. The victims came from every stratum of society: peasants and nobles, children and elderly, clergy and lay people, all found themselves dragged before these tribunals. The trials consumed themselves like a cancer, as each tortured confession invariably implicated new victims. Entire families were wiped out. The wealthy found their property confiscated to fund further prosecutions. The poor were accused of maleficium, harmful magic that explained crop failures and livestock deaths. Among the most chilling aspects of these trials was their targeting of children. Boys and girls, as young as 7 years old, were subjected to the same brutal interrogation techniques used on adults. The logic was simple and horrifying. If witchcraft was hereditary, then the children of witches must themselves be practitioners of the dark arts. Court records describe in clinical detail how children's small bodies were stretched on the rack, how their tiny fingers were crushed in thumbscrews, how they were made to watch their parents burn before being consigned to the flames themselves. The trials followed a predictable pattern that revealed their true nature as state-sponsored terror. Accusations would begin with the marginal members of society, the old, the poor, the mentally ill. Under torture, these initial victims would be forced to name accomplices. The lists of supposed co-conspirators grew ever longer and more prominent. Soon, wealthy merchants, respected clergy, and even members of the nobility found themselves in the dock. The witch hunters had discovered that confiscated property from convicted witches could fund their operations indefinitely. One of the most documented cases was that of Johannes Junius, a former mayor of Bamberg who left behind a smuggled letter describing his ordeal, written in a trembling hand. Likely, while chained in his cell, Junius detailed how he was tortured until he confessed to crimes he had never committed. He described the agony of the Sträpathie, where victims were hoisted by their arms tied behind their backs until their shoulders dislocated. He wrote of the excruciating pain of the leg screws, devices that slowly crushed the bones of the shins. Most heartbreaking of all, he described how the torture broke his mind as well as his body, forcing him to accuse innocent friends and neighbors to make the pain stop. The trials also revealed the sophisticated legal framework that the prince-bishops had constructed to legitimize their actions. They employed learned jurists who crafted elaborate legal justifications for their procedures. The famous Malleus Maleficarum served as their manual, but they went far beyond its prescriptions. They developed standardized questionnaires for interrogations, created detailed taxonomies of magical crimes, and established bureaucratic procedures for managing the flow of cases through their courts. The sheer scale of the enterprise was staggering. In Bamberg alone, court records show that over 1,000 people were executed in a 5-year period. The city's population was decimated. Entire neighborhoods stood empty, their former inhabitants nothing but ash scattered to the winds. The prince-bishop's treasury overflowed with confiscated wealth, funding ever more elaborate prosecutions. Professional witch hunters traveled from village to village, their arrival heralding fresh waves of terror. What finally brought these trials to an end was not moral awakening, but political pressure. The Holy Roman Emperor, Ferdinand II, initially supportive of the witch-hunting campaigns, began to receive complaints from noble families whose members had been caught up in the prosecutions. The Swedish invasion during the 30 Years' War also disrupted the trials, as the prince-bishops were forced to focus on military rather than spiritual concerns. By 1631, the great witch-hunting machine had largely ground to a halt, leaving behind scarred landscapes and traumatized populations. The legacy of the Würzburg and Bamberg trials extends far beyond their immediate victims. They demonstrated how quickly civilized society could descend into systematic barbarism when fear was weaponized by those in power. They showed how legal and religious institutions could be perverted to serve the basest human impulses. Most chillingly, they revealed how ordinary people could become complicit in atrocities, when those atrocities were sanctioned by authority and wrapped in the language of righteousness. Today, the archives of these trials remain largely unstudied, their thousands of pages of court records a testament to humanity's capacity for organized evil. The prince-bishops who orchestrated these horrors are buried in magnificent tombs, their crimes forgotten by history. But in the quiet corners of Bavaria, in the villages where the smoke once rose from burning pyres, memory lingers. The past, as they say, never rests easy. Part 7. The Island of the Dead. Finnish paganism on trial. In the remote forests of 16th century Finland, where the northern lights danced across endless winter nights and ancient spirits still whispered through the pines, Christianity and paganism waged a silent war for the souls of the people. This was not the dramatic clash of armies or the public spectacle of grand inquisitions. This was a quiet, methodical campaign of cultural extermination that played out in isolated villages and sacred groves, far from the eyes of history. The island of Korpu, nestled in the treacherous waters of the Finnish archipelago, became the epicenter of this forgotten struggle. Here, on a wind-swept outcrop of granite and birch, the old ways had never truly died. The villagers still left offerings at the sacred springs, still sought the wisdom of the wise women who could speak to the spirits of the forest. They baptized their children in the Christian church, but they also carried iron charms against the evil eye. They attended Sunday Mass, but they still gathered at the summer solstice to honor the sun's return. This delicate balance between old and new was shattered in 1576, when a new pastor arrived from the university city of Turku. Reverend Matthias Laurentius was a man of the new learning, educated in the humanist traditions of the Reformation. He had read the works of Lutheran theologians who condemned all remnants of pagan practice as diabolic witchcraft. He saw it as his sacred duty to purge his parish of these corruptions, to bring the pure light of the gospel to these benighted souls. At first, Laurentius employed the gentle methods of persuasion. He preached fiery sermons against the heathen abominations that persisted in his parish. He visited the homes of suspected practitioners, attempting to convince them to abandon their old ways. He organized prayer meetings and Bible studies designed to replace the traditional gatherings at sacred sites. For a time, it seemed his efforts were bearing fruit. The more obvious pagan practices went underground, driven from public view by the pastor's relentless campaign. But Laurentius was not satisfied with mere surface compliance. He knew that beneath the veneer of Christian orthodoxy, the old beliefs persisted. The villagers still consulted the wise woman Eno Korhanen when their children fell ill. They still made offerings at the sacred grove on the island's highest point. They still celebrated the ancient festivals, though now they called them by Christian names. The pastor's frustration grew as he realized that he was fighting not just individual superstitions, but an entire worldview that had been shaped by centuries of tradition. The breaking point came during the harsh winter of 1577. A series of unexplained deaths had struck the village. 3 children taken by fever, an elderly fisherman found frozen in his boat, a pregnant woman who died in childbirth along with her infant. In the old days, such tragedies would have been attributed to angry spirits or broken taboos. But Pastor Laurentius saw something far more sinister at work. He began to whisper of maleficium, of harmful magic practiced by those who had refused to fully embrace the Christian faith. The pastor's suspicions fell first upon Eno Korhanen, the village wise woman. She was an elderly widow who lived alone on the margins of the settlement, gathering herbs and tending to the sick with remedies passed down through generations of women. Her knowledge of healing plants and her ability to ease pain and suffering had made her indispensable to the community. But to Laurentius, these very qualities marked her as a dangerous practitioner of forbidden arts. The accusations began slowly, almost tentatively. A woman whose cow had died after Eno treated it for illness. A man whose fishing nets had torn after he had refused to pay the wise woman's modest fee. A mother whose child had suffered nightmares after receiving one of Eno's herbal remedies. In the atmosphere of fear and suspicion that Laurentius had fostered, these ordinary misfortunes took on sinister significance. The pastor employed the full weight of his authority to build a case against Eno. He preached sermons that painted her as a servant of Satan, a woman who had traded her soul for supernatural power. He organized prayer circles where the faithful would confess their fears and suspicions about the wise woman's activities. He reached out to church authorities in Turku, painting a picture of a parish under siege by diabolical forces. The response was swift and decisive. A special commissioner was dispatched from the bishop's court, armed with the authority to investigate and prosecute cases of witchcraft. The commissioner, a learned man named Erik Sorolainen, brought with him the latest techniques of interrogation and the most advanced theological understanding of the diabolic threat. He also brought something else, a portable torture device known as the boot, designed to crush the bones of the feet and legs until the victim confessed to whatever crimes were alleged. Eno Korhanen was arrested on a cold February morning in 1578. The charges against her were extensive: practicing harmful magic, consorting with evil spirits, causing the deaths of livestock and humans through supernatural means. She was taken to the island's small church, which had been converted into a makeshift courtroom for the proceedings. The sacred space where she had once worshipped now became the site of her destruction. The trial that followed was a masterpiece of legal theater designed to legitimize a predetermined outcome. Witnesses were called to testify about strange occurrences in the village. A woman claimed to have seen Eno flying through the air on a broomstick. A man swore that he had witnessed her conversing with a black cat that spoke in human voices. Children testified that she had attempted to lure them into the forest with promises of magical treats. Each piece of testimony was carefully recorded by the court scribe, creating an official record of diabolic activity. But testimony alone was not enough. The law required confession, and confession required persuasion. Ino was subjected to increasingly severe interrogation techniques designed to break her will. Sleep deprivation weakened her resistance. Threats against her remaining family members played on her emotions. When these psychological pressures failed to produce the desired result, the commissioners turned to physical torture. The boot was applied to Ino's feet with methodical precision. Iron wedges were hammered between her legs and the metal constraints, slowly crushing the bones. The pain was excruciating, but Ino remained defiant. She maintained her innocence, insisting that her healing work had been a gift from God, not the devil. Her resistance only convinced the commissioners that they were dealing with a particularly dangerous and well-protected witch. The torture continued for 3 days. Ino's legs were permanently crippled, her feet reduced to mangled masses of broken bone and torn flesh. Still, she would not confess. It was only when the commissioners threatened to arrest her teenage granddaughter that the old woman's resolve finally cracked. In a voice barely above a whisper, she agreed to confess to whatever crimes they wished to record. The confession that emerged was a masterpiece of theological imagination. Ino admitted to making a pact with Satan, to attending nocturnal sabbats, where she and other witches had plotted the destruction of the Christian community. She confessed to shape-shifting into animal form, to flying through the air to distant locations, to brewing potions that could kill or heal according to her whims. She named other members of the community as her accomplices, setting in motion a chain of accusations that would consume the village. The executions began in the spring of 1578. Ino was the first to burn. Her broken body tied to a stake erected on the island's highest point, the same sacred grove where her ancestors had once honored the old gods, now witnessed her destruction. 7 other women followed her to the flames over the following months, each one tortured until she confessed to diabolic crimes that existed only in the minds of their accusers. The impact on the village was devastating. The traditional knowledge of healing plants and folk remedies was lost as the women who carried it were destroyed. The communal celebrations that had marked the changing seasons were abandoned out of fear that they might be seen as pagan survivals. The sacred sites that had been honored for generations were desecrated or abandoned, their spiritual significance forgotten as the community sought to distance itself from anything that might be construed as unchristian. But the greatest tragedy was the loss of the old world itself. The trials had not just destroyed individual lives, they had shattered an entire way of understanding the world, the ancient compact between human and nature. The belief that the forest and the sea were alive with spirits that could be honored and appeased was broken forever. In its place came a new vision of nature as a fallen realm, hostile to human flourishing and requiring constant vigilance against diabolic influence. The island of Corfu still exists today, now connected to the mainland by a series of bridges and ferries. Tourists visit in the summer months, drawn by the natural beauty of the archipelago and the quaint charm of its historical sites. But they find little trace of the events that unfolded there over 4 centuries ago. The church where Ino was tried has been renovated and restored, its dark history sanitized for modern visitors. The sacred grove where she died has been reclaimed by nature, its significance lost to time. Only in the local folklore do traces of the old tragedy persist. Fishermen still speak of strange lights seen dancing over the water on winter nights. Some claim to hear voices calling from the empty forests, the spirits of the wise women still seeking justice for their suffering. The island remembers, even if the history books have forgotten. Part 8. The Pendle Witches, England's Forgotten Covens. In the shadow of Pendle Hill, where the moors of Lancashire stretch endlessly toward the horizon, and the wind carries whispers of ancient secrets, a story unfolded in 1612 that would become one of the most famous witch trials in English history. Yet, despite its notoriety among scholars, the tale of the Pendle Witches remains largely unknown to the general public, buried beneath centuries of more sensational narratives and political upheavals. The events that would lead to the destruction of 2 entire families began on a cold March morning when a traveling peddler named John Law encountered a young woman named Alison Device on the road near Colnlaw. A Halifax merchant making his rounds through the scattered villages of the Pendle region was carrying a pack of pins, buttons, and other small wares that formed the backbone of rural commerce. Alison, a member of one of the area's most notorious families, approached him with a request to purchase some pins. What happened next would ignite a chain of events that would consume the entire region in fear and suspicion. According to the official records, Law refused to sell his wares to Alison, claiming that she could not afford his prices. The young woman allegedly cursed him in her frustration, and within minutes, Law collapsed to the ground, partially paralyzed and unable to speak clearly. The merchant's sudden affliction, coming so immediately after Alison's angry words, seemed to confirm the darkest suspicions about the Device family and their supernatural associations. The Device family had long been viewed with suspicion by their neighbors. They were desperately poor, living in a crumbling tower called Malkin Tower that had once been a defensible structure but had deteriorated into little more than a hovel. The family matriarch, Elizabeth Southerns, known locally as Old Demdike, was widely believed to be a witch. Her reputation for supernatural knowledge and her ability to heal certain ailments had made her both feared and sought after by the local population. Old Demdike's rivalry with another suspected witch, Anne Whittle or Old Chattox, had been a source of tension in the region for decades. The 2 elderly women represented different approaches to the practice of folk magic. Demdike was known for her healing abilities and her knowledge of protective charms, while Chattox was feared for her supposed ability to bring harm to those who crossed her. Their feud had drawn in their extended families and created a web of suspicion and counter-accusation that permeated the entire area. The paralysis of John Law provided the spark that ignited this powder keg of accumulated tensions. Roger Noel, the local justice of the peace, saw in the incident an opportunity to address what he perceived as a growing threat to law and order in his jurisdiction. Noel was a man of the new learning, educated in the latest theories about witchcraft, and determined to bring the full weight of the law to bear against what he saw as a diabolic conspiracy. The interrogation of Alison Device revealed a wealth of information about the supposed supernatural activities of her family. Under questioning, she admitted to having made a pact with the devil, describing how a black dog had appeared to her and promised her the power to harm her enemies. She confessed to using this power against John Law and detailed other instances of maleficium that she claimed to have performed. Most damaging of all, she implicated her grandmother, Old Demdike, as the one who had initiated her into the dark arts. The arrest of Old Demdike opened the floodgates of accusation and counter-accusation. The elderly woman, by now perhaps 80 years old and nearly blind, was subjected to intense interrogation about her supernatural activities. The confession that emerged painted a picture of a woman who had been practicing witchcraft for decades, teaching her skills to family members and neighbors, and using her powers to settle scores and protect her interests. According to the official records, Old Demdike confessed to having made a pact with the devil some 20 years earlier. She described how a spirit, calling itself Tib, had appeared to her in the form of a brown dog and promised her the power to harm her enemies and heal her friends. She admitted to using this power to kill several people in the area, including a man named Richard Ashton, who had refused to give her alms, and a child belonging to a family that had offended her. The investigation quickly expanded to encompass the rival Chattox family. Anne Whittle, the family matriarch, was arrested along with her daughter, Anne Redfern. Under interrogation, Old Chattox provided her own confession, describing a decades-long career of witchcraft that paralleled and rivaled that of Old Demdike. She admitted to making a pact with a spirit called Fancy, who appeared to her in the form of a man clad in black. She confessed to using her powers to kill livestock, cause illness in her enemies, and steal goods through supernatural means. The trials that followed were conducted with all the procedural rigor that the English legal system could muster. The accused were formally indicted by grand juries, tried before petty juries, and represented by counsel. The evidence presented against them included their own confessions, the testimony of witnesses who claimed to have seen them performing supernatural acts, and expert testimony about the nature of witchcraft and its dangers to society. One of the most damning pieces of evidence was the testimony of Janet Device, Alison's younger sister, who was only 9 years old at the time of the trials. Janet provided detailed testimony about the supernatural activities of her family members, describing sabbats held at Malkin Tower where the assembled witches plotted the destruction of their enemies. Her testimony was particularly powerful because of her youth. The legal system of the time held that children were incapable of the sophisticated deception required to fabricate such detailed accounts of supernatural activity. The trials also revealed the complex social dynamics that had made the witch hunting possible. The accused came from the margins of society, families that had been struggling with poverty and social isolation for generations. Their accusers, by contrast, were generally more prosperous and well-connected members of the community. The witch trials provided a mechanism for settling old scores, eliminating social undesirables, and reinforcing the boundaries of acceptable behavior. The religious dimension of the trials was equally significant. The accused were portrayed not just as practitioners of harmful magic, but as enemies of the Christian faith itself. Their supposed pacts with the devil were seen as acts of apostasy that threatened the spiritual welfare of the entire community. The trials thus became a form of religious warfare, with the forces of good and evil locked in mortal combat for the souls of the faithful. The executions took place on August 20th, 1612, at Lancaster Castle. 10 people were hanged that day, including Old Demdike's daughter, Elizabeth Device, her son James Device, and Anne Whittle. Old Demdike herself had died in prison before she could be brought to trial. Perhaps a merciful end for a woman who had already suffered decades of poverty and persecution. The executions were attended by crowds of spectators who had come to witness the destruction of the supposed diabolic conspiracy. The impact of the Pendle witch trials extended far beyond the immediate victims. The trials established precedents for the prosecution of witchcraft cases that would be followed for decades to come. They demonstrated the power of child testimony in witchcraft cases, a legal innovation that would have tragic consequences in later trials. They also showed how effectively the apparatus of the state could be mobilized against marginal and vulnerable populations when social tensions reached a breaking point. The trials also had a profound impact on the local community. The destruction of the Device and Chattox families eliminated not just individuals, but entire networks of folk knowledge and traditional practice. The wise women who had provided healing services and protective charms to the local population were gone, their knowledge buried with them. The fear generated by the trials discouraged others from practicing traditional folk magic, leading to the gradual erosion of customs and beliefs that had sustained rural communities for centuries. Perhaps most significantly, the Pendle trials demonstrated the deadly intersection of poverty, gender, and supernatural belief in early modern England. The vast majority of the accused were women, and almost all of them came from the margins of society. Their supposed crimes were intimately connected to their roles as healers, midwives, and keepers of traditional knowledge. The trials thus represented not just a legal proceeding, but a form of social cleansing, removing women whose very existence challenged prevailing notions of proper feminine behavior. The legacy of the Pendle witch trials continues to resonate today. The story has been retold countless times in books, films, and television programs, usually focusing on the more sensational aspects of the accusations and confessions. But beneath the lurid details of diabolic pacts and supernatural sabbats lies a more complex and troubling story about the dynamics of power, fear, and social control in early modern England. The moors around Pendle Hill still bear the scars of these events. Local tourism has embraced the witch trials as a source of historical interest, with walking tours and interpretive centers that promise to reveal the secrets of the past. But the darker truths about social marginalization, legal persecution, and the destruction of traditional knowledge remain largely hidden beneath the surface of popular entertainment. In the end, the Pendle witch trials serve as a reminder of how quickly fear can overwhelm reason, how easily legal institutions can be weaponized against the vulnerable, and how the past continues to haunt the present in ways that we are only beginning to understand. The witches of Pendle may be long dead, but their story continues to speak to us across the centuries, warning us about the dangers of scapegoating and the fragility of justice in times of social crisis. Part 9. The Witch Hunts of Benin, Africa's War on Child Witches. In the humid heat of West Africa, where ancient traditions clash with modern evangelical Christianity and poverty creates fertile ground for desperate explanations, a horror continues to unfold that makes the historical witch trials of Europe seem like distant nightmares. In the nations of Benin, Nigeria, Ghana, and the Democratic Republic of Congo, children as young as 3 years old are being accused of witchcraft, tortured, exiled, and murdered in numbers that dwarf the casualties of the Salem witch trials. This is not ancient history. This is happening now in the 21st century, in communities where smartphones and satellite dishes coexist with beliefs in supernatural maleficium that would have been familiar to the witch hunters of medieval Europe. The victims are the most vulnerable members of society: orphans, disabled children, those who exhibit unusual behavior or suffer from mental illness, and the offspring of families torn apart by poverty and social dislocation. The roots of this modern witch hunting can be traced to the complex intersection of traditional African spiritual beliefs, colonial disruption, and the explosive growth of Pentecostal Christianity across the continent. In traditional Yoruba Fon, and other West African religious systems, witchcraft was understood as a real but manageable threat. Communities had established mechanisms for dealing with suspected witches, usually involving ritual purification, social mediation, or, at worst, exile from the community. The colonial period disrupted these traditional systems without replacing them with effective alternatives. European administrators, focused on economic extraction and political control, showed little interest in understanding or supporting indigenous approaches to social harmony. Christian missionaries, meanwhile, demonized traditional spiritual practices while often incorporating belief in witchcraft into their own theological frameworks. The result was a spiritual vacuum that left communities vulnerable to new and more destructive forms of supernatural fear. The modern epidemic of child witch accusations can be traced to the 1990s, when a new generation of Pentecostal churches began to proliferate across West Africa. These churches, often led by charismatic pastors who promised prosperity and spiritual protection, brought with them a virulent form of Christianity that saw demonic influence everywhere. Unlike traditional African approaches to witchcraft, which focused on community healing and restoration, these new churches emphasized spiritual warfare and the complete destruction of demonic forces. The economic context of these accusations cannot be ignored. In countries like Benin, where the average annual income is less than $1,000 and unemployment rates exceed 40%, families struggle to provide basic necessities for their children. When faced with unexplained illness, business failure, or other misfortunes, the identification of a supernatural cause can provide both explanation and a focus for action. Children, especially those who are perceived as burdens on family resources, become convenient scapegoats for adult frustrations and fears. The process of accusation typically follows a predictable pattern. A family or community experiences some form of misfortune, a death, illness, business failure, or crop failure. Seeking an explanation, they turn to religious leaders, traditional healers, or self-proclaimed prophets who claim the ability to identify supernatural threats. Children who exhibit unusual behavior, suffer from disabilities, or are simply in the wrong place at the wrong time become the focus of suspicion. The accusations often begin with subtle signs that adults interpret as evidence of supernatural malevolence. A child who suffers from epilepsy may be accused of being possessed by evil spirits. A child who exhibits signs of autism or other developmental disorders may be seen as unnaturally influenced by demonic forces. Children who are particularly intelligent or precocious may be suspected of having access to supernatural knowledge. Even normal childhood behaviors, like bedwetting, nightmares, or difficulty in school, can be interpreted as signs of diabolic influence. Once suspicion falls on a child, the process of confirmation and punishment begins. The accused children are subjected to interrogations designed to extract confessions of supernatural activity. They are asked to describe their supposed meetings with spirits, their participation in nocturnal flights, their responsibility for causing harm to family members and neighbors. The questions are leading and specific, designed to elicit the responses that will confirm adult suspicions. When verbal interrogation fails to produce the desired confessions, physical torture often follows. Children are beaten with sticks, burned with hot irons, forced to drink dangerous concoctions, or subjected to other forms of physical abuse designed to break their resistance. The torture is often justified as a form of spiritual deliverance, a necessary step in freeing the child from demonic influence. In some cases, the torture is administered by religious leaders who claim to be performing exorcisms. The confessions that emerge from these torture sessions follow familiar patterns. Children admit to flying through the air to attend meetings with other witches and spirits. They confess to being responsible for the deaths of family members, the failure of crops, or the illness of neighbors. They describe elaborate supernatural conspiracies involving dozens of other children and adults. These confessions, extracted through torture and fear, are then used to justify further accusations and punishments. The consequences for accused children are devastating. Those who are not killed outright are often expelled from their families and communities, forced to survive on the streets of urban areas where they face hunger, disease, and further abuse. Many turn to crime or prostitution as survival strategies. Girls who are accused of witchcraft often become victims of sexual exploitation, their supposed supernatural powers making them both feared and desired by those who believe they can benefit from contact with them. The international response to this crisis has been inadequate and often counterproductive. Western aid organizations and human rights groups have struggled to understand the cultural context of these accusations and have often focused on symptoms rather than causes. Efforts to rescue accused children without addressing the underlying social and economic conditions that make the accusations possible have had limited success. In some cases, well-meaning interventions have actually made the situation worse by confirming local beliefs about the supernatural powers of the accused children. The role of popular culture in spreading and legitimizing these beliefs cannot be underestimated. Nollywood, the Nigerian film industry, has produced hundreds of movies that feature child witches as central characters. These films, which are widely distributed throughout West Africa, often portray children as inherently evil and dangerous, requiring violent intervention to protect society. The films reinforce stereotypes about the supernatural powers of children and provide detailed scripts for accusations and confessions. Religious leaders play a crucial role in both perpetuating and potentially addressing the crisis. Many Pentecostal pastors have built their reputations and congregations on their supposed ability to identify and combat supernatural threats. They offer deliverance services that promise to free families from the influence of child witches, often charging substantial fees for their services. Some of these pastors have become wealthy and powerful by exploiting the fears of desperate families. However, other religious leaders have begun to speak out against the accusations and abuse of children. They argue that the focus on child witches represents a distortion of Christian teaching and a betrayal of the Church's mission to protect the vulnerable. These voices remain a minority, but their influence is growing as the international community brings pressure to bear on governments and religious organizations. The legal response to child witch accusations has been inconsistent and often ineffective. Many countries have laws that ostensibly protect children from abuse, but these laws are rarely enforced when the abuse is justified on religious or cultural grounds. Police officers, judges, and other officials often share the same beliefs about witchcraft as the general population, making them reluctant to intervene in cases involving supernatural accusations. Some governments have begun to take more aggressive action. In Nigeria, several states have passed specific laws criminalizing the accusation of children as witches. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, the government has worked with international organizations to establish programs for the rehabilitation of accused children. However, these efforts remain limited in scope and effectiveness, hampered by corruption, lack of resources, and the persistence of underlying beliefs. The psychological impact on accused children is profound and long-lasting. Many suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, and other mental health problems as a result of their experiences. The stigma of being labeled a witch follows them throughout their lives, making it difficult for them to form normal relationships or participate fully in society. Even children who are eventually reunited with their families often face ongoing suspicion and discrimination. The international community has a moral obligation to address this crisis, but the solutions are complex and must be culturally sensitive. Simply condemning the beliefs and practices involved is not enough. Any effective response must address the underlying social, economic, and cultural factors that make these accusations possible. This requires long-term investment in education, economic development, and social support systems that can provide alternatives to supernatural explanations for misfortune. The tragedy of Africa's child witch hunts serves as a stark reminder that the human capacity for cruelty and scapegoating is not limited to any particular historical period or cultural context. The same fears and prejudices that led to the witch trials of early modern Europe continue to operate in the modern world, claiming new victims and destroying families and communities. Only by understanding and addressing these underlying dynamics can we hope to prevent future tragedies and protect the most vulnerable members of society. Part 10. The Siberian Witch Trials. Russia's Quiet Inquisition. In the vast expanse of Siberia, where winter nights stretch for months and the taiga forest holds secrets older than memory, a campaign of religious persecution unfolded that remained hidden from the world for centuries. Far from the political centers of Moscow and St. Petersburg, in villages accessible only by reindeer, sledge, and river barge, Orthodox priests and Tsarist officials conducted a systematic campaign against shamans, traditional healers, and anyone who clung to the old ways of understanding the world. This was Russia's Quiet Inquisition, a methodical effort to erase indigenous spiritual traditions and replace them with Orthodox Christianity. Unlike the spectacular witch trials of Western Europe, the Siberian persecution was conducted in shadows and silence, its victims disappearing into the wilderness without fanfare or historical record. The few documents that survived the chaos of revolution and war provide only glimpses of a campaign that consumed countless lives and destroyed entire cultures, had developed sophisticated spiritual systems that were intimately connected to their harsh environment. These systems, centered around shamanic practices and animistic beliefs, provided frameworks for understanding and surviving in one of the world's most challenging landscapes. The shamans who served these communities were not merely religious figures, but essential pillars of social organization. They diagnosed and treated illness, predicted weather patterns, mediated disputes, and maintained the delicate balance between human communities and the spiritual forces that inhabited the natural world. Their knowledge encompassed everything from herbal medicine to astronomical observation, from conflict resolution to the complex rituals that marked the passage of seasons and the transitions of life. The Orthodox Church viewed these shamanic traditions as diabolic obstacles to the salvation of souls. The solution was to establish a network of priests and lay officials who would work systematically to identify and eliminate indigenous spiritual practices, directing them to cooperate with Orthodox missionaries in the suppression of shamanic practices. The language of these instructions was carefully crafted to avoid direct mention of witch trials or religious persecution, instead focusing on the need to eliminate harmful superstitions and diabolic influences that threatened the spiritual and temporal welfare of the empire. The methods employed in this campaign were adapted to the unique conditions of Siberian life. Unlike the public spectacles of European witch trials, the Siberian persecution was conducted quietly and efficiently. Shamans were arrested during the long winter months when travel was difficult and communities were isolated. They were transported to distant locations where they could be interrogated without interference from their followers. The interrogations themselves were conducted in Russian, a language that many of the accused did not speak, making effective defense impossible. The charges leveled against Siberian shamans followed predictable patterns. The evidence against them consisted primarily of testimony from converts to Christianity who had been coached to provide the specific details that would support conviction. The shamans' ritual objects, their drums and masks and sacred bundles, were seized and burned as evidence of diabolic activity. One of the most thoroughly documented cases involved a Tungus shaman named known for his ability to heal the sick and his knowledge of the traditional stories and songs that preserved the history of his clan. His arrest was orchestrated by Father Innokenty Kolchitsky, a zealous Orthodox priest who had been sent from Moscow to establish a mission in the region. Sambu's shamanic drum, decorated with symbols representing the spiritual geography of his people, was presented as proof of his diabolic associations. The trial itself was conducted according to Orthodox ecclesiastical law, which allowed for the use of torture to extract confessions from suspected practitioners of witchcraft. Sambu was subjected to prolonged interrogation, sleep deprivation, and physical abuse designed to break his resistance. The torture was administered by lay officials under the supervision of Orthodox priests, who justified their actions as necessary steps in the process of spiritual deliverance. Despite the torture, Sambu initially maintained his innocence, insisting that his practices were directed toward healing and helping his people rather than causing harm. He argued that his spiritual work was compatible with Christian faith, pointing to the many similarities between shamanic and Orthodox practices. His resistance only convinced his interrogators that they were dealing with a particularly dangerous and well-protected practitioner of the dark arts. The confession that emerged was a masterpiece of theological imagination, detailing decades of supposed diabolic activity that perfectly matched Orthodox expectations about the nature of shamanic practice. His confession became a blueprint for further prosecutions, providing the template that would be used to destroy shamanic traditions across eastern Siberia. Sambu was executed in the spring of 1735. His body burned to prevent any possibility of shamanic resurrection. His shamanic implements were publicly destroyed, and his followers were forbidden from practicing any form of traditional spiritual activity. The broader impact of his trial extended far beyond his immediate community, as word of the prosecution spread throughout the region and other shamans went into hiding or abandoned their practices altogether. The systematic nature of the Siberian witch trials becomes clear when examining the official correspondence between local administrators and their superiors in Moscow. These documents, preserved in the Russian State Archive, reveal a coordinated campaign that targeted not just individual shamans, but entire spiritual traditions. Military commanders were instructed to seize shamanic objects during routine patrols. Tax collectors were directed to report suspicious activities they observed during their rounds. Even ordinary settlers were encouraged to inform on their indigenous neighbors, with rewards offered for information leading to successful prosecutions. The questions asked during interrogations demonstrated detailed knowledge of shamanic rituals, seasonal ceremonies, and traditional healing practices. This knowledge was used to construct elaborate theories about the diabolic nature of indigenous religion, theories that justified the complete destruction of traditional spiritual systems. The impact of the persecution on indigenous communities was devastating. The shamans who were destroyed had been the keepers of traditional knowledge, the repositories of cultural wisdom that had been passed down through generations. With their elimination, entire systems of understanding about the natural world, about healing and spiritual practice, about the proper relationship between humans and the environment, were lost forever. The psychological impact on survivors was equally profound. Those who had witnessed the trials and executions carried the trauma with them for the rest of their lives. Children who had been raised in traditional spiritual systems were forced to navigate a world where their most fundamental beliefs were criminalized. The fear generated by the trials discouraged the transmission of traditional knowledge. The Orthodox Church's victory in Siberia was not complete, however. Despite the systematic persecution, elements of shamanic tradition survived in hidden forms. Some shamans continued to practice in secret, passing on their knowledge to carefully selected disciples. Others adapted their practices to incorporate Christian elements, creating syncretic spiritual systems that could survive scrutiny by Orthodox authorities. The old gods did not die easily in the Siberian wilderness. The legacy of the Siberian witch trials extends far beyond the immediate victims. The destruction of indigenous spiritual traditions had profound ecological consequences. As traditional knowledge about sustainable relationships with the natural world was lost, the psychological trauma inflicted on indigenous communities contributed to social problems that persist to this day. The methods of cultural destruction pioneered in Siberia would later be applied to other indigenous populations throughout the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union. Perhaps most significantly, the Siberian trials demonstrated the capacity of imperial states to conduct systematic campaigns of cultural genocide while maintaining the appearance of legal legitimacy. The careful documentation of the trials, the adherence to established procedures, and the theological justifications provided by Orthodox authorities created an illusion of justice that masked the underlying reality of ethnic and religious persecution. Today, the archives of the Siberian witch trials remain largely unstudied. Their thousands of pages of court records and official correspondence, a testament to one of history's most successful campaigns of cultural destruction. The vast majority of Russians remain unaware of this dark chapter in their nation's history, and the indigenous peoples of Siberia continue to struggle with the legacy of centuries of persecution and cultural suppression. In the endless forests of Siberia, where the old sacred sites lie forgotten and the spirits of the ancestors wait in silence, the memory of the quiet Inquisition lingers like smoke from ancient fires. The shamans are gone, their drums silent, their stories untold. But the land remembers, and in the whisper of wind through the taiga, in the dance of the northern lights across the winter sky, something of the old ways survives. waiting for a time when it will be safe to speak the forbidden names and sing the ancient songs once more. The Siberian witch trials serve as a stark reminder that the human capacity for systematic cruelty is not limited by geography or climate. In the most remote corners of the world, where it seemed that traditional ways of life might survive the encroachment of modernity, the machinery of persecution found ways to operate. The quiet Inquisition of Siberia may have lacked the dramatic spectacle of European witch trials, but its impact was no less devastating for being conducted in shadow and silence. The past, as they say, never rests easy, and in the case of Siberia's forgotten victims, the truth was indeed buried for a reason. The Russian Empire, and later the Soviet Union, had no interest in preserving the memory of a campaign that revealed the true nature of their civilizing mission. But the documents survive, hidden in archives and forgotten filing cabinets, waiting for historians brave enough to confront the uncomfortable truths they contain. They are waiting, these spirits, for justice that may never come, for recognition that may never be given, for the restoration of traditions that may be lost forever. In the vast silence of the Siberian wilderness, where the snow falls without sound and the cold penetrates to the bone, the quiet Inquisition continues to cast its shadow across the land and its people. Thank you for listening to No Sleep Historian. Please like and subscribe for more content.